related to ballot measures leading up to this year, a bit about what it means for transit overall and why it's important for the country, and then we'll have a story of firsthand success of a city leveraging successful ballot measures to dramatically advance transit. If we could go to the second slide. I'm honored to be joined today by Richard White, the CEO of APTA, the American Public Transportation Association, and longtime transit champion Phoenix Mayor Greg Stanton. I'll give you longer introductions for each of them a little bit later in the webinar. I do want to mention from the outset here that we will take questions at the end of the program, and you can enter your questions using the dashboard box on the side of your screen under questions. Just type those in. We'll get them and relay them to the panelists at the conclusion of the program. So Kirsten, if you could go to the next slide. I'd like to start with some, and advance one more please, start with some numbers and some context for this year's races. Let me say just a quick word about CFTE at the outset. Our organization has been focused on transit ballot measures beginning back in 2000, and we maintain a comprehensive data set of all the campaigns that have been run on transit from 2000 through this year. Our focus really has been to monitor what's happening around the country, to analyze what works and what doesn't at the ballot box in terms of success for transit ballot measures. And of course, we are supported by and were founded by APTA back in 2000. So let me turn now to the real story, the headline story about election 2016. We have on ballots this year the single largest number of measures that we've ever seen in a 12-month period, again dating back to when we first began monitoring these more than 15 years ago. In addition, this year's election will see the highest number of states with measures on the ballot. So those aren't necessarily statewide measures, but communities in 25 different states will vote on public transportation investment measures. So that's half of the country, and it's important to keep in mind that many states still don't allow, or at least not allow very easily, local communities to go to the ballot. So we're seeing broad geographic distribution of these measures. At the same time, we're seeing a large number of overall measures. And it's the dollar amount that I think has been extraordinary this year, the largest that we've seen since we began monitoring these measures, nearly $200 billion at stake on Election Day at the ballot box for public transportation. And we have reason to be optimistic heading into the election. I'll go through the specific numbers in a couple moments, but so far this year, 75% of the transit measures that have gone before voters have been successful. So let's dig a little bit deeper into exactly what's on tap this year. Here's a map simply showing the overall distribution of the 77 measures. So some of these have already happened, and I'll break those out for you in just a second. But you can see here what I was referencing in terms of the broad geographic distribution across the states. What's a little harder to discern from this map, but I'll show you in more detail in a second, is that this is a phenomenon that affects all sorts of cities, counties, municipalities, large and small. So we have everything from some of the largest cities in the country to small towns and townships dotted across the landscape. So this is a broad as well as deep phenomenon. If you could go to the next slide. This gives you a sense of exactly what we're looking at in terms of 2016 measures, in terms of what precisely is on the ballot in terms of the nature of the funding. And it's important to keep in mind that these are typically tax-related measures. We do have a few advisory measures and amendments on the ballot this year, but the overwhelming percentage involve local taxes or dedicated fees of some sort. This year, pretty evenly split between sales tax and property taxes, and that's been consistent with what we've seen over the course of the last 15 years, that those two things tend to be the dominant tools in the toolbox for these ballot measures. At the same time, it's important to realize that the authorizing legislation for most of these measures doesn't allow a great deal of flexibility. In many states, you either have to go for property taxes or you have to go for sales taxes. We are seeing a bit of experimentation around the margins where people are looking at bundled measures and other sorts of dedicated revenue sources. We've had 28 measures go to voters year to date. Again, with the aforementioned 75% of those 28 measures being successful. I think it's useful to keep in mind as well that as you look at the map of the country, I mentioned that we're in half of the states already, but not every state allows the authority. So one of the trends I think we're going to be looking at going forward is more and more communities pushing their states for the authorization to go to the voters to use the ballot as a tool for generating investment. I suspect that will accelerate in 2017 and beyond, particularly as communities look around and see how many of their peers across the country are successfully using these tools. For election day itself, so the 77 measures is the entire universe of calendar 2016 ballot measures, but looking more specifically at election day itself at November 8th, you can see here 49 measures on ballots across the country, again with that familiar distribution of sales, property taxes, and assorted other constitutional amendments, bond measures, and other types of funding packages. Once again, we see small cities represented, large cities. You'll notice that there's a significant cluster of measures in California. California this year will be home to the single largest number of local ballot measures of any state. And that's important to keep in mind because California also has a supermajority requirement for passage. So when you think about the success rate for these measures, for much of the country, that success is built on 50+1 at the ballot box, but in California, that supermajority requirement puts an even higher hurdle for passage. And California, despite having that supermajority requirement, has a history of being quite successful at the ballot box, I think underscoring the popularity, the typical popularity of these measures with voters. If you could go to the next slide. I just wanted to highlight a few of the notable campaigns that are happening around the country. Let me just say that if you want details on all of the 77 measures that are on ballots this year, we do keep a list on the website so you can go through and get more details. But just some of the highlights that I think are really piquing people's interest in ballot measure campaigns this year. Of course, the single largest measure in Los Angeles County, Measure M, would dramatically extend a variety of transit services across LA County, that being not only the largest measure on the ballots this year, but the largest that we have seen since we've been counting measures. There's a combination of sales and bond measures in the Bay Area supporting transit there. A half-cent sales tax in San Diego that would account for more than $18 billion for transportation investment in San Diego County. So again, that's only some of the many measures on ballots in California. We're seeing Atlanta move forward on a number of fronts, and this is really building on some recent successes there. Clayton County, one of their suburban jurisdictions, had success at the ballot box a couple of years ago. The city had success with a bond package earlier, and now they're moving forward with a half-cent sales tax in the city of Atlanta itself. So after having a setback at the ballot box a few years ago, that region is really now moving forward with a number of measures advancing transit across that region, and in particular in the city of Atlanta. One of the really interesting races around the country will happen in southeast Michigan, the Detroit area, where 4 counties will go to the ballot box on nearly $3 billion worth of transit investment around BRT lines and commuter rail. So a real effort there in a city almost synonymous with the automobile to consider embracing public transportation in a very aggressive way. But other places too. Wake County, North Carolina, the Raleigh area would become the final piece of the counties that make up the research triangle to have adopted successful transit measures. There's a half-cent sales tax on the ballot there. And again, significant dollars at stake in all these races. The Raleigh measure would be over $2 billion worth of transit investment. Washington State, home to a number of measures. One of the most talked about around the country would be the Sound Transit 3 measure in Seattle, which is a blend of different funding pieces. And the interesting thing about Seattle, and I think something that makes it perhaps a harbinger for other places across the country, is that the issue there hasn't really been whether to move forward with this, but how fast can they get service to the communities in that region that are demanding it. Speaking again, I think, to the popularity and the demand for this investment. But Seattle isn't the only action in Washington State. There's a sales tax measure in Spokane as well. Again, just to give you a sense that this isn't all just about larger communities. We do have some statewide measures. Those are less common, but we have a bond package in Maine. We have a constitutional transportation trust fund measure in New Jersey, just to name a couple. And as I mentioned before, a lot of smaller communities, towns and townships dotted around the state of Michigan. Michigan, in addition to their marquee measure in southeast Michigan in the Detroit region, nearly 20 different communities across Michigan either have been on ballots this year or will be on ballots, most of them smaller systems. If you go to the next slide, please, I want to give you some sense of where we have been over time. So 2016 certainly shaping up to be a very significant year, a historic year, but there's a longer track record here of success. So you can see the support over time for these measures. If you add up, aggregate all of the various ballot measures that have gone before voters since 2000, the cumulative win rate is above 70%. 71% of those measures have been successful. If you compare that with other sorts of ballot measures, you would find, we're told by political scientists who looked into these referenda, that success rate is significantly ahead of other kinds of ballot measures. So there's something unique and distinctive, I think, about the support that voters have given to these ballot measures that support public transportation investment. And if you'll notice, the success rate didn't decline as you might have expected with the recession or with some of the challenging politics across the country around budgets and taxation. If anything, the phenomenon has strengthened over time. And in an era of fairly dramatic polarization, particularly around tax and spending issues, to have 71% approval rate, I think, is striking. On the next slide, you can see the steady growth in the use of these measures. We split these out because the off-cycle measures, there are fewer places that allow communities to go to the ballot in non-general election years. But you can see that in both cases the trend line has been pretty steadily upward. So 77 on ballots this year, dramatic new record for ballot measures, but it really builds on a record that was set a year ago for off-cycle measures when we had the largest number on record in 2015. I think this is in part a reflection of the success of these measures. In part, it's a reflection of the challenging investment and budget environment at all levels of government for transportation investment. And this has become a ready tool and one that has proven popular with voters. If you go to the next slide, this just gives you a final sense of sort of the mix of funding types that we have seen across the years that we've been watching these measures. Again, the lion's share of these being in the sales tax category, and then the overwhelming majority as sales or property tax measures. We are seeing some growth in some of those other categories. But you know, it's important to keep in mind that these are local decisions and local investments using the local tools that are available. One of the things we have seen consistently in these measures is that in part their success is driven by people's understanding of the specific benefit and value that they're going to derive out of them, hence their willingness to use the tax tools at their disposal to provide the investment. If you could go to the next slide, Kirsten, I want to turn it over to our next panelist, give him a quick introduction here. Honored to have Richard White with us today. He's the acting president and CEO of the American Public Transportation Association. He spent his entire career in transit and public transportation, including a decade as general manager and CEO of the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Agency. He also led BART in the Bay Area as deputy general manager and later as general manager. He's also served in senior management roles at Houston Metro, New Jersey Transit, as well as leading private firms and the federal government. Truly someone who has seen every facet of the industry and has a proven record of leadership and understanding of what's happening around the country. Let me turn it over to you, Richard.
Approximately $200 billion in funding will be on ballots in 49 communities across the country on November 8th. This is truly a historic figure that could help transform communities across the country. Think of it this way. A local ballot initiative is a catalyst for a community to implement its vision of the future. And the 75% high passage rate that Jason just talked about shouldn't be surprising. And after all, public transportation is important to billions of individuals across the country. In 2015, 10.6 billion trips were taken on public transit, and 34 million passengers are dependent on public transportation each and every workday. For many people, it provides access to jobs. In fact, nearly 60% of trips taken on public transportation for work commutes. It also helps people save money. Our latest transit savings report says that on average nationally, a person who switches his or her daily commute from driving a car to taking public transit can save close to $10,000 a year, and that's a lot of money. So with improved public transportation services made possible through passage of a local referendum, more people would have access to jobs and more people would be able to save money. And from the perspective of a community, public transportation's economic impact is tremendous. Every $1 invested in public transportation generates approximately $4 in economic returns. We also know that employers want to locate to communities that have a strong public transportation system so they can have access to the best possible workforce. Many of you are probably aware of all of the commercial and residential development that occurs around transit stations. And actually, residential values are increased by more than 40% when they are located near high-frequency transit service. All this adds up to creating an economically prosperous community. Public transportation also helps to reduce traffic congestion and improve air quality. And additionally, a very recent study released by APTA shows that public transit can make a community much safer since it dramatically reduces automobile crash risk. So as we say at APTA, wherever public transportation goes, community grows. And ballot measures are important catalysts for helping a community grow, and they serve a variety of purposes. A ballot measure might start a new system, renew it, improve it, expand it, or pay for its operations. I'd like to give you two quick examples of past transit ballot measures that have and are making a tremendous difference for these communities. In 2004, voters in the Denver metropolitan area passed a ballot initiative totaling $4.7 billion. And I think if you look at Denver today and where it's heading, it is a much more attractive place for people to live and work, and that's due to the public transportation improvements that are underway, planned, and are actually happening. Their public transportation program is adding 122 miles of commuter rail and light rail service, 18 miles of bus rapid transit, 21,000 new parking spaces at light rail and bus stations, and enhanced bus and rail connections across the 8-county district. Another important second example is community transit in Everett, Washington. During the recession, this operator was forced to cut their service by really a devastating 37%. Last November, voters passed a sales tax measure to not only restore its lost service, but to expand it as well. And community transit is now implementing a major service increase, and just did in September, and has ordered new buses as it prepares for future service expansion. So later today, you're going to hear from Phoenix Mayor Greg Stanton on how Phoenix is likewise being transformed thanks to the passage of local ballot measures, and is now another great success story. Finally, let me end by emphasizing how important the partnership is between local, state, and federal governments in regard to public funding. If you look at the slide that's now just come up on the screen, you can see that all levels of government, local, state, and federal, contribute to the funding of a public transportation system. While not all local or state funding comes from ballot measures like the ones next week, this chart does illustrate how critical local and state funding is, as it constitutes about 45% of the total transit funding picture. So in conclusion, successful public transit ballots have a track record of positively transforming a community and for providing improved access to opportunity and quality of life for those that live there. So I really strongly encourage every person who can vote on a public transit referendum on next Tuesday to do so. Not only will you benefit, but so will your community. Thanks for your interest, and I look forward to taking your questions later.
Great, thanks so much. Just a quick reminder, if you do have questions, feel free to enter those in so that our panelists can take them at the conclusion of remarks. Let me now introduce Phoenix Mayor Greg Stanton. Since taking office, Mayor Stanton has worked to build a modern economy that works for every Phoenix family by boosting trade, investing in biosciences, and lifting up small business. He is leading the way to creating an innovation-based economy in Phoenix. He's also demonstrated commitment to making Phoenix a more welcoming and open place. Under his leadership, Phoenix became the first city to end chronic homelessness among veterans, and also the first city in Arizona to earn a perfect score on the Human Rights Campaign's City Equality Index. He attended Marquette University, earned a law degree at the University of Michigan. Before becoming mayor, he served 9 years on the city council and also as Arizona's Deputy Attorney General. In 2005, he won re-election and also successfully led the Phoenix ballot measure that will triple the city's light rail system. It's my pleasure and honor to turn the program over to Mayor Stanton.
Well, Jason, thank you very much. It's my honor to be on here and talk about what we've done in the city of Phoenix and how the investments we made in transportation has massively advanced our economy in a positive direction. You said many nice things about me and introducing me about some of the things that I've personally worked on, but when it comes to transportation, here's the most important thing. I grew up in a bus family. I grew up in West Phoenix, which is a working class part of the city, and my dad took the City of Phoenix bus every day to and from work to his job selling shoes at JCPenney in downtown Phoenix. So for as long as I can remember, my family relied on a bus to get around, and we couldn't have raised 4 kids and put us through college, etc., if we didn't have a great public transportation system in the city of Phoenix. So for me, supporting transportation is in my DNA. And so I was lucky enough last year to have the opportunity to lead the way to put Proposition 104 before Phoenix voters. Proposition 104 was part of a 35-year, $32 billion infrastructure investment plan for transportation, and it passed successfully. It passed overwhelmingly. In fact, that was on the same ballot as my own re-election, and both of us got through successfully. With Proposition 104 in Phoenix, we're going to massively expand our light rail system, tripling the amount of light rail in the city of Phoenix, massive improvements to our bus, including longer bus hours, which we just put into place earlier this week. So we started at 4 a.m. and we're going to go to midnight, and we're going to make even more improvements to our bus system next year, massive improvements to dial-a-ride, make the city more bikeable, including implementing our complete streets policy, more walkable city, and street repairs as well. And we're beginning the street repairs right away. The reason why it's successful is because we had a strong base to build upon. Phoenix voters had voted on a sales tax in the year 2000 to improve public transportation. It put in the initial 20-mile light rail system that we have. It's been hugely successful. $8 billion of investment has occurred in our city as the direct result of the transportation infrastructure investment that we've already made. Arizona State University, the largest university in the United States of America, has built a significant campus in our downtown. That campus which is advancing education, increasing the college attainment rate in our community. That campus doesn't occur if we don't make significant investments in public transportation. Phoenix hosted 2 years ago the Super Bowl, and we had 1 million people come to our downtown. We don't have that event hosting massive concerts in our downtown unless we have a significant investment in light rail and public transportation improvements. With Proposition 104, the item that passed our ballot just last year, we're already making plans to bring light rail to the people of South Phoenix, which is a portion of our city that has traditionally been where the highest percentage of Latinos and African Americans. It's a poor part of the city, and we wanted to make sure that we sent a message that that part of our city needs infrastructure investment so that the people of South Phoenix have a full and fair opportunity to jump on that light rail and get to ASU downtown or ASU main campus in Tempe or visit employment centers throughout our city. And by the way, give people from throughout the city the opportunity to visit South Phoenix, which is a wonderfully culturally diverse part of Phoenix. We've been named as one of 11 Ladders of Opportunities project by the Department of Transportation, the only one west of the Mississippi. So we're working closely with Washington, D.C. to make sure we get support for that project. Although as mayor, I also understand that the relationship between cities and Washington, D.C. is fundamentally different. We need infrastructure investment across the United States of America, but if we wait around for Washington, D.C. to do it, we're going to be waiting a long time. Cities have to be much more self-reliant, have an honest conversation with your voters about what the needs are in community, willing to put, in our case, a sales tax increase on the ballot to ask voters the question, how do you want to advance our city? Do you really want to advance our economy and educational opportunities for the people of the city? Have that honest conversation that, you know, the money is not going to flow from Washington like it used to. In fact, in our measure, we only estimated that 30% of the resources, the matching funds, would come from Washington, that the rest was going to come from us here locally. That represents a significant sea change from how cities used to interact with Washington. I think a city like Phoenix in the western United States, one of the largest cities in America, by the way, 5th largest city in terms of population, you know, we embrace the fact that we need to be a little more independent, and we appeal to that ethic in our voters when we put that on the ballot. Anyway, the bottom line is this: the existing transportation infrastructure investments that we've made in the city of Phoenix have advanced our economy in tremendous ways, and the people saw it, and that's why they overwhelmingly supported Prop 104, which unless LA passes theirs, our investment will be the largest in the country. It's been the largest in the country in a long period of time. Very proud of that fact, because the people of our community saw the direct connection between transportation infrastructure improvements and advancing our economy. Building a more innovative export-based economy is directly related to our success in public transportation.
Well, thank you so much, Mayor Stan. Appreciate those comments and appreciate all the work that you've done personally in Phoenix to make these ballot measures happen. We're about to take some questions, so again, if you have questions for any of the panelists, feel free to enter those in. While folks are going ahead and putting their questions in, let me kick things off with a question for each of my co-panelists. Mr. Mayor, let me start with you. You were a prominent vocal champion of the last campaign in Phoenix. What lessons do you think other elected leaders, other mayors around the country should take from your experience in Phoenix?
Well, first off, thanks for the question. Yeah, I mean, bottom line for me personally is I needed to be all in as the mayor of the big city in the state of Arizona, one of the largest cities in America. I couldn't vote to put something on the ballot and then, you know, passively say to the voters, you guys decide. No, I needed to show leadership, roll up my sleeves, and get actively involved. In fact, in my case, my re-election campaign as mayor and my campaign supporting Proposition 104 in so many ways almost became the same campaign, because my vision for advancing the city through public transportation investments was so related to the reasons why I love being mayor and wanted to be elected for 4 more years. So the reality is you can't hand it off to somebody else. Mayors and other leaders that have the bully pulpit have to personally get involved and put their political names and reputations behind it. And I don't want to give any advice to any of the mayors in terms of what they should and shouldn't do. I can only tell you what worked in my situation. So my personal involvement, I think, was a big difference maker. We got the business community to support it. The business community, our local chambers of commerce endorsed our public transportation infrastructure investment because they understood how important it was from a workforce perspective to be able to get people to and from various employment centers throughout not only Phoenix but the entire Valley of the Sun. AARP was actually, this was the first local initiative in their history that they supported, was Proposition 104 in Phoenix, Arizona. We worked with every neighborhood group, community group. We built a very strong grassroots coalition. Now, it should be noted that in 2000, when we passed our original transportation infrastructure investment, that was 0.4%, by the way. That was a 20-year measure. Ours in last year was a 35-year, $32 billion measure, a 0.7% sales tax. You know, when we originally had the vote in 2000, there was a lot of skepticism about whether or not it was too expensive, whether investments in light rail and the bus improvements were really worth the level of investment, whether it would be success or whether people would actually ride it. Ironically, for the reauthorization and expansion that we did last year, those critics were not there. There wasn't an issue about whether people would ride light rail or the buses because they've been overwhelmingly successful. The real issue for us was some people opposed it because they said with changes in the larger transportation landscape, like ride-sharing companies that are coming to the forefront, like driverless cars that are coming to the forefront, will the landscape be changing such that we don't need things like light rail? My message to them was that a great city like the city of Phoenix needs to provide as many transportation options as possible, and that includes a great airport, a great light rail system, great buses, great bus rapid transit, great bikeability as a city. It's got to be a more walkable city as well, particularly in the urban heart of the city. You got to provide dial-a-ride, and you've got to be very open-minded to ride-sharing companies and being open to innovative ideas like driverless cars. It's all part of a comprehensive transportation system that provides as many options as possible. One is not the opposite of the other, and supporting ride-sharing companies and supporting other forms of public transportation should not be exclusive of each other. In fact, they very much complement each other, and that was an important argument that needed to be made to overcome some of the critics that were concerned about large-scale fixed route investments.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Dick, let me turn to you for a quick question here. The New York Times editorial page this weekend wrote a piece about the importance of transportation ballot measures, and they noted the declining federal share of investment. What do you think the response to this trend, this phenomenon of ballot measures should be from Washington?
Well, I'd say we've had a long history of a federal role in transit investment. It goes all the way back to the 1960s. So it's enduring. It certainly needs to continue, and there really must be a continuing strong role, even though we just had recent success of the passage of the Surface Transportation FAST Act. I think we need to say the job's not done yet. There's still a lot more to be done, and kind of listening to what the mayor had to say about cities recognizing that they really have to be a little more self-reliant and independent, and they need to really sort of supplement what Washington is doing in the pace with which Washington can continue to provide support. And those who see the need to go faster are going to the voters and asking for their approvals to try to help accelerate a program, and in some cases to try to help bring match to the federal program as well. So, I think we'll see the communities continue to recognize the importance of supplementing what the feds can do, but I think there really always will be and needs to be a role for the federal government in supporting the surface program, especially the transit program.
Great, thanks. Have a large number of questions queued up here, so let's get right to it. Let me start with a question for Mayor Stanton. Question here about the Prop 104 campaign and the percentage by which the measure passed.
It passed by 56%.
Excellent, thank you.
And by the way, that's off the top of my head, so we're going to real-time double-check it. If I got it wrong, I'll correct the record while we're still on this call.
Excellent. And I can note for the reporters on the line, if you're interested in some of those historic measures, those are archived as well, so you can go back and search by year on the website to pull the win-loss numbers. The next question, and I guess this is for anyone on the panel who wants to take it. The question is, obviously many Americans are disgusted and fed up with this year's election. The two candidates are among the least popular in history. What would you say to motivate those voters who were totally turned off by the presidential race to participate in down-ballot questions?
I don't know if our elected official, the mayor, wants to take that one.
Wow, that's a loaded question. How many more days before this election over? 6 more days? Like that? All right. Well, first off, look, the reality is, you're right. Obviously, the presidential election is taking up all of the air in the room, if you will, virtually nonstop coverage on the news, and so much of it is negative that the concern is that voters will be so turned off that there will be a lower voter participation. Unfortunately, by the way, that may be the strategy of at least one of the presidential candidates, but that's a whole different story. Here locally, we have in Phoenix, we have so many important issues down ballot. In our county, we have a sheriff's race. Sheriff Joe Arpaio is a very high-profile elected official. I personally am supporting his opponent. We're trying to motivate people to suggest you need to participate in that election. We have issues like a minimum wage increase on the ballot that people are almost unaware of, again, because the presidential election is taking up all of the airwaves, if you will. I don't know, the honest answer is I just use whatever bully pulpit I have to remind people, particularly young people, because this is so critically important. These transportation infrastructure investments are going to be there for a long period of time. They're going to benefit the lifestyle of so many young people. And everyone on this call knows that as cities are really in the business of attracting talent, I want my best and brightest to stay here in Phoenix, not move to another city, and I want to attract talent from other communities because they enjoy the lifestyle here in Phoenix. Public transportation investments are critically important to building that lifestyle that particularly young people, young college graduates want to have. You got to be a bike-friendly city. You got to be a walk-friendly city. You got to have great arts and culture. You got to have great public transportation. You got to be urban. That's so important. And so really, it is an important argument to make to young people that even if you aren't excited about the top of the ticket, by the way, you should vote at the top of the ticket. Even if you're not excited about it, you still should vote for a candidate at the top of the ticket. But more importantly, or equally as importantly, look at those down ballot measures, especially local measures. They're the ones that are really going to impact your lives day to day in the communities you live in.
Jason, the only thing I'd add to what the mayor said is, irrespective of what people may think of the two candidates running for president and the potential impacts of decision making on down ballot issues or people who are on the ballot, the two candidates are talking about the importance of investing in infrastructure. The United States is really lagging behind other modern nations with respect to what we spend on infrastructure. It's going to be the next president's job to frame that issue and to sell it to the next Congress. So this is important. People need to think about how that down ballot candidate might vote on that infrastructure question. And then just secondly, just to say, the message of today is as much about the measures that are the local ballot measures that are in front of voters to decide the future of their own communities and the importance of them coming to the polls to vote for that as well.
Great, thanks to both of you. Next question is one about our statistics. What share of the $200 billion would go to public transit versus roads? I think I can handle this one. The way we calculate that number, that's all transit investment. Now, it doesn't mean that every measure that's going before voters is transit only. In many cases, there's a mixture of modal investments. What we have tried to do is disaggregate those to try to understand the percentage of funding that is intended to be allocated for the transit piece. So if you look at the total universe of all transportation measures, that number would be even higher. So the approximately $200 billion that we're talking about is a transit investment number. Next question here. What's the reason these kinds of measures are becoming more common?
Well, I think it was already kind of said, is that you know, people don't want to wait for the natural progression of what has been the traditional way of seeing these large-scale, multi-year transit investment projects to be developed, planned, developed, funded, and implemented. People want to see these move faster. So you know, there is the interest to go for some more self-help to do that. To both accelerate the implementation of a program and also to generate local money to help match a federal program. In the old days of the federal government spending 80% of a new transit project are long gone. It's much closer, the norm is much closer to the 50-50 percentile. So people who want to see these investments happen in their lifetime and for their children and children's children to be able to take advantage of, they want to see it speeded up and to sort of supplement the role that the federal government is playing by putting local dollars to work.
I would just add, this is Greg Stanton, I would just add, we see more of these measures because people like public transportation. You provide great public transportation options. Our experience here in Phoenix, people use it. I mean, Phoenix has sometimes been described as the ultimate suburban sprawl city, and yet when we have put significant transportation infrastructure in place, including light rail, it's been overwhelmingly popular, well beyond what the original ridership projections were. And once somebody has that experience, good experience on a bus or light rail, they're a supporter for the rest of their lives. So people want these projects. They understand, they intuitively understand that these projects do help improve the lives of so many people in the community to be able to get easier to work or school or doctor appointment, etc. And we see so much urban style development up and down the light rail line, particularly near the light rail stops, and living a more urban lifestyle is so much more popular these days. Cities are going through a renaissance all over the country, including here in Phoenix, where most of the action is in the heart of the city, in downtown and midtown. And not just young people, but a lot of empty nesters are choosing to sell their large home with a large yard and move to the heart of the city in a multi-housing environment along a light rail line where they can walk or take light rail to the symphony, ballet, or opera, or the other things that they love to visit anyway. So it's really, people want these items. They want to advance their cities, and it's really the public that's demanding it.
I have a question here from a reporter in the Virginia Beach area where there is a referendum on the ballot regarding light rail. They say that the political fighting has been extremely bitter, and the question is, how would you characterize the tone of campaigns around transit ballot measures across the country? I don't know, Mayor Stan, if you want to talk about the tone and the two campaigns in Phoenix?
Well, you know, look, you have political people on both sides of the issue, and in our case, we had a hard-fought but yet respectful campaign. So at least in our community, it was one heck of a Donnybrook, as it should be. You know, when you're talking about investment at the level that we're talking about, we should have a healthy public dialogue. But in terms of the ugliness of it, I guess in Phoenix we were fortunate to avoid that.
I would just say, you know, having looked at a lot of these races, it's variable. In some communities, particularly in races over renewals of existing levies, it can be a pretty low-profile campaign without a lot of organized opposition. But as the mayor said, you know, these can attract folks who have very strong points of view about taxes and federal, local budgets and investment in these projects. So there's no question that in many instances the higher profile campaigns do do attract opposition. I don't know that I would characterize it as particularly nasty in terms of being personal, but it is certainly spirited in some places, and I think it generally reflects, philosophical disagreements in those communities sometimes between coalitions who are interested in more investment versus folks who are anti-tax, and we have seen as that national question has waxed and waned, it affects these local measures. But again, very telling, I think, that despite sort of that national tone that can be very negative on these issues, that the measures in general have been very successful. Next question relates to private funding and public-private partnership models, and the question is, in cities that use these ballot measures to advance projects, is there room once you have done that for tapping into private capital?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the two examples I gave of what was a recent success in the past is really the poster child for the answer to your question, and that's Denver. Denver is implementing a big portion of their light rail and commuter rail program through a public-private partnership. It is one of the largest uses of P3s for a transit program in the United States. Actually, quite frankly, it's really the first instance of a true P3 model where there's private equity investment put at risk as a part of the program, and it's been a very successful contracting model. So I know a lot of people are sort of anxious to watch as that unfolds its longer-term success. Here in Maryland with the Purple Line, although not on the ballot, is going to be another step forward with P3s. Around the world, it's much more common than it is in the United States. North of the border in Canada, it's a very big tool for advancing infrastructure and transit projects. So I think there is a very continuing and evolving role for more of that. I think more of our transit agencies are seeing the potential benefits of that. There's a big difference usually between whether it's a greenfield project, a start from scratch new project, which usually lends itself a little bit more to this model than something that's an extension of an existing system. But I think there is growing acceptance in the transit community for the use of P3s when the conditions are right.
Great. Next question is whether there's any indication how the measures on the ballot will do on election. I can certainly get that started. As I mentioned, we've had 20 measures already voters this year, with 3/4 of those passing. So when you combine that figure with the much longer historic record going back to 2000 of 71%, I think we can be reasonably confident that we'll have a solid majority of the measures on ballots pass. Now that said, I would caution that nearly 20 of the measures will be subject to that supermajority requirement, which is an awfully high hurdle for those advocates to clear. So we'll have to see, but I think there's good cause for optimism for the communities that have measures on ballots next week. The next question is about the growth of these measures and whether there is a concern of exhaustion or reaching the limit of local taxation, or is that possibility too far down the road to worry about?
Well, I mean, I think as some of the data that it's been said in the comments, I think the key to all of this is that the local communities and those who are asked to vote on these measures have to have a high degree of confidence, in the ability to deliver these projects and programs. It must be the outgrowth of a very participatory process. I think the mayor clearly spoke to the importance of the community input and planning process, and that is absolutely critical. So when it's inclusionary, when it's based on a good integrated planning process, when the business community and others have an opportunity to participate, I think then the public has a good basis to determine in their confidence, and they can also make value judgments of the investment in this versus investments that the local communities have to make in other important program areas as well.
The only thing this is Greg Stan, the only thing I'd add on that is, in my experience, people don't mind spending taxpayer money, on occasion even increasing resources, as long as they don't believe the money's going to be wasted, as long as they know it's going to go for valuable projects that are going to advance their local economy. And with public transportation, at least in the city of Phoenix, when we have placed these items before the voters, we've had good, solid, detailed plans on how the money was going to be spent. Obviously, we've built up a track record of success of keeping our promises, and so the public's willing then to invest even more. So, the anti-tax folks, I think in general, if they're just going to be against taxes at all, well, that's probably not a winning argument. Of course, they're against wasted taxes, as they should be, but I think these measures in Phoenix and throughout the country have proven to be good, solid, long-term, valuable investments, and people are willing to put their money in favor of those sorts of projects.
Next question is related to the rise of private ride-sharing services and how it has affected or may affect support for ballot measures and transit-related infrastructure. Is about whether young people will continue to support these measures in light of the rise of private ride-sharing services. Thoughts from either of you on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's important is that there are a set of options that are available to people on how to meet their mobility needs. And I think, for a good chunk of those that involve carrying large numbers of people, that's going to be a line haul transit system, usually a rail system or a very, very high quality bus rapid transit system to do that. But we are really seeing transformations in mobility. There's really a paradigm shift with ride-sharing services, with the Lyfts and the Ubers. And I think what we're seeing is really an embracing of that with respect to their very important roles that can be that can be served by these new mobility options, and they are going to be a growing and important part of the future, and they need to be a part of the entire balanced network, because today somebody may want to use a ride-sharing service or a bike-sharing service or walking on one end of the trip and needing a car service on the other end of the trip that's delivered by a light rail system. So this is all about a multimodal, integrated network of choices for people who live in communities to meet their mobility needs in ways that reduces their dependency on the single occupant automobile, which really, over time, has sort of led to some of the serious challenges that our community have on dispersal and sprawl, congestion, and air quality. And the millennials and the empty nesters and others, the mayor spoke of the kind of the greater density and urbanization pockets that are sort of coming up around these light rail investments. It's really about a package of options, including these services, but driven by the bulk, really the workhorse, which is the line haul transit service.
I think this is Greg Stan. I think with regard to the ride-sharing companies, is probably a greater long-term threat to the traditional automobile industry. The idea that every person has to own their own car, and when they're not using it, park their car in a garage or a parking space somewhere, is probably a greater threat to that traditional model than it is to public transportation infrastructure investments. And of course, when the ride-sharing companies work with public transportation, the results can be great. We talked about public-private partnerships. What about using ride-share companies to help solve the last mile or 2-mile problem in public transportation, which is one of the vexing issues that public transportation officials throughout the country have to deal with. Is, if you're going to take light rail, but your appointment is a mile or 2 away from the light rail stop, you don't have to necessarily take your personal vehicle. Take light rail to the end of the line, and then jump on a ride-sharing operator and get to your doctor appointment or to your school or whatever. So actually, I would argue that working together, ride-sharing companies and public transportation can leverage each other to maximum effect.
Next question is about the pros and cons of bonds versus sales or property taxes when they're on the ballot. I can just say that CFTE, we have looked at this at least in terms of pass rates and found, perhaps not surprisingly, that bond measures tend to pass at the highest rate of any of the different tools that are available, but not by a whole lot. And in fact, there's not a whole lot of differentiation among the three tools that were mentioned there: bonds, sales taxes, and property taxes. I don't know that there's statistical evidence to say one is much more popular than the other, and typically, as I think I mentioned in my earlier remarks, most communities don't have a great deal of choice about what tool they take to voters. Either they're locked in by existing legislative or constitutional language, or they've got a specially adopted authorization to go to the voters that puts in a particular funding mechanism. But in general, bond measures are a much smaller percentage of the overall universe of ballot measures. They do tend to pass a little bit more frequently, but not by a great deal. I don't know if either of the other panelists have thoughts about the differences between those tools.
I do not. That was good. That was a good.
I think a lot of it comes down to the kind of the local affordability and its ability to assume more debt, and the predictable nature of having a funding source to incur that debt, so you can spend now and move projects along faster and pay later. So I think that's kind of the choice that gets made between the various options.
Great. We're coming close to the top of the hour. Take one more question here. There are a few others in the queue that we're not going to have a chance to get to, but we will follow up with you separately to get your questions answered. But the next question here is about climate change and its connection to these measures. The question is, what impact would the ballot measures have on climate change on an aggregate level and on an individual level, and are carbon emissions a concern with voters? I can start there on the latter issue, perhaps. I think it's very context specific, and different communities approach the benefits of transit investment and which ones to focus on in different ways. So the kind of campaign that we might see run in some communities where there's a strong demonstrated interest in climate or other sort of environmental stewardship issues, you tend to see that issue reflected more prominently in the campaign. In other places, it's more a focus on the economic impacts, perhaps. Although, as APTA would be quick to tell you, there's lots of good statistics to suggest that there are benefits across the board, whether you're talking about economy or environment, to transit investment.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that APTA has sort of had various types of studies done on this. One of which we show that transit saves 37 million metric tons of carbon emissions a year. So that's a pretty compelling statement. But I would also say, kind of apropos to it's kind of really unique to the local conditions and the local situations. But more and more infrastructure systems and networks and assets across the country have to pay more and more attention, to the issue of resiliency. Are they resilient, to the impacts of climate change? But are they resilient to the impacts of hurricanes and other sorts of issues that manifest themselves? So I think we have to have, a network that is as resilient as it can be. And I know some transit systems, when they take the opportunity to engage in reinvesting in the system, they look at opportunities to improve the resiliency of the system to protect against future potential impacts.
The only thing I'd add on that is in Phoenix, Arizona at least, when I became mayor 5 years ago, a book had just been published called Bird on Fire, which made the argument that Phoenix was the least sustainable city on planet Earth. So that's how I started my tenure as mayor. I personally have made climate change issues and sustainability a very important part of my administration, improving on that. In fact, Phoenix recently received the U.S. Conference of Mayors Award for our climate policies. We actually were ranked #1 in the entire country for our climate policies. That being said, on the specific issue of the ballot measure, Proposition 104 that passed last year in Phoenix, the argument that was made to the public involved, #1, connecting people to education, 2, connecting people to employment centers, and 3, the investment, the private sector investment that had been already made along light rail, the $8 billion and all the benefits that went along with it. The argument about sustainability and climate change and how greater transportation infrastructure investment would help the city of Phoenix achieve our goals as it relates to sustainability, I would argue that was more of a secondary argument that was made to those communities that cared more passionately about it. It wasn't what I would describe as a general market argument that we made on behalf of transportation. Although as a substantive matter, we know that if we're going to achieve our goals as it relates to sustainability and fighting climate change, it's not going to happen through Congress. It's going to be cities and mayors that step up to the plate and show leadership. So it's an incredibly important issue, and I don't want to in any way suggest that it's a tier 2 issue. It's a very critically important issue. But as it relates to the arguments we made to the public for the ballot measure, it was not one of our primary arguments.
Great. Well, we've run out of time. I want to say a special word of thanks to my panelists, Mayor Stanton from Phoenix, thank you very much. Dick White from APTA, thanks as always. If anyone on the line has other information needs or questions, please do feel comfortable reaching out to CFTE and the team at APTA. You can see some of our contact information there on the screen. We will be tracking all of the measures on ballots on Election Day, so look to our websites and look to our social media feeds for information on what we anticipate will be a very successful night at the ballot box for transit and a historic year for transportation ballot measures. Thanks to everyone for joining us.